Merci beaucoup donc d'être venu. Aujourd'hui, on a la chance, aujourd'hui et demain, d'avoir la visite de Brent GROCHOLSKI, qui est donc l'un des éditeurs du journal Science, qui a, alors j'ai fait pas mal de publicité autour de ça, et donc un certain nombre d'entre vous ont pris rendez-vous et vont le rencontrer. Mais là, on a une petite heure et demie où il va d'abord faire un séminaire. Donc pour ceux qui étaient peut-être un peu timides ou qui avaient des questions un peu plus générales, ça sera l'occasion ou jamais de les poser à Brent. Voilà, donc sans plus attendre, je lui cède la parole. Thank you, Brent. The floor is yours.
Oh, wow. Okay. All right. Bonjour. Thank you for having me here and taking some time out of your schedule to show up and hear what I have to say. I guess I'm being recorded as well, so I better not say anything too controversial, right? Okay. My name is Brent GROCHOLSKI. I'm an associate editor at Science Magazine, and the goal of my presentation is just to give you an idea of the sort of process that we have at Science for how we decide which papers to publish in our magazine, and also hopefully to give you a sort of general idea of what's important for publishing, both in high-profile journals and elsewhere. I've been an associate editor at Science for about 3 years, and the talk is not all too long. My intention is to have plenty of time for questions. If you do have a pressing question, you can feel free to interrupt me, though, and I'll try to answer it to the best of my ability. All right, so Science Magazine is actually owned and operated by this organization, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and that's where I'll start. So many people don't really know what we actually are, the AAAS. Well, we were founded in 1848, and we've been the publisher of science since 1900. We like to call ourselves, because we are the world's largest general science society. We have about 120,000 members. The membership rolls have been increasing since the U.S. election in November. And we have members from 91 countries. You do not need to be it's not only a U.S.-based organization. We do have international members. We have an annual meeting that tends to be more for the news people. And we also have things like science and technology policy fellows and mass media fellows. The goal of those is to try to get more scientists involved in government and also in the media to communicate science more clearly to the public. And we have the AAAS itself has a lot of education, advocacy, diplomacy efforts. And we're also a not-for-profit organization, and so that's important for some people when choosing a publisher. And if that's something that matters to you, then we have some journals for you. All right, so let's start with a brief history of science. Science was founded in 1880 on $10,000 of seed money from Thomas Edison, this gentleman here. That's a picture of the first issue of Science. If you have really good eyes, you can read that like all the advertisements are on front, magic lanterns and some optical stuff. Edison was involved in film along with some people from France, and the advertisements really haven't gone away from scientific publishing, but maybe they're a little bit less annoying. So. All right, so today we're still a weekly magazine, and we have both news and research sections. We still produce a print magazine. If you're interested in the print, it's a little bit different experience, but we also have an extensive website with expanded online content. This is just a brief picture of our look. We have what we like to call a modern print design. So they sort of redid all the print features about in 2014 to sort of make it a little bit more slick for presentation. The art department works hard on these covers, which are often quite spectacular. And then we have a website and a mobile app that's not. It's a much better mobile app than our previous mobile app, which didn't really seem to work. So they spent a lot of time working on it to try to make it functional. So Science has a family of journals now. I think that most people in this room probably weren't aware that we've actually had sister journals for quite some time, Science Signaling and Science Translational Medicine. More recently, we launched Science Advances. This is our open access journal. It's also supposed to be for a general and broad range of topic areas. And then we have 2 more subject-specific journals that we launched last year, I think, Science Robotics and Science Immunology. And, it's not quite as extensive as the sort of the nature stable of journals, but we do have the ability to transfer articles in between the different journals to try to make things easier for authors. It's worth pointing out that we have a quite good news department, and if you're interested in science news, it's worthwhile to have this bookmarked. We have over 30 award-winning staff writers, editors, and correspondents, and they're located throughout the world. In addition, so they're a great news staff. They're probably, I think they're the largest, at least in North America, as the science bureaus in various newspapers have kind of dissipated over the years. All right, so moving on to the sort of editorial side, so the research side, which is where I lie. This is a picture of our editorial staff. We have about 30 PhD-trained research editors, and we handle papers across all scientific fields. Sometimes people ask me how I got into this, and I think like all the editors, it's a little bit by accident. They happen to be looking for somebody with my background, which is mineral physics, while I was looking for a job actually in government, since I was based in DC. But I got my BS in physics at the University of Minnesota. I did some pharmacology in the meantime before I went to Berkeley to get my doctorate in Earth and Planetary Sciences. I did a postdoc at MIT and also at the National Museum of Natural History, the Smithsonian Institute, which is what originally brought me to Washington, D.C., and that's where I'm currently based now. I actually handle quite a wide array of topic areas. All the science editors are asked to be broad, and so I handle not only earth science, mostly solid earth stuff and things related to solid earth, but I also handle quite a bit of material science, metals, amorphous materials, and then it's even some applied physics like thermoelectrics and thermal transport. And that's just to give you an idea that, when you send me a paper, if you send any science editor a paper, we may not be an expert in the field that you're in, which means it's really important to try to communicate clearly exactly what the importance of your research findings are. All right, so what does an editor for science actually do? Simply put, I find the best manuscripts to publish. So I spend a lot of time reading submissions and then deciding which ones are going to go for review. I arrange for the reviewers, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then in the end, I make the decision to accept or reject a manuscript for publication. So if you're unhappy with the decision, you can blame me. If you're happy, you can blame me, whichever way it goes. We also spend some time designing special issues and also inviting review articles. The special issues, I put one together on natural hazards last year. And review articles, we tried occasionally to get an article that basically just will broadly cover an area of interest that, is usually what we like for review articles is something that's maybe a field that's like 70% complete, but there's still like 30% of really interesting problems to work on. So it has some perspective in addition to a review. I spend time traveling into meetings and institutions. So one of the reasons I'm here is part of our international outreach efforts. And we really like to meet with scientists at meetings and at institutions to find out what everyone's doing. And, to communicate and try to, give researchers a sense of what we're looking for in science in a paper that you might send to Science for publication. Right, so when I do travel, occasionally I solicit top research. It doesn't happen all that often, but occasionally I see something that's really, really exciting, and I ask them to send it in, and then just getting an idea where different fields are at. I spend some time actually doing some real, actual editing, where when we have a manuscript that's actually gotten reviews that support publication, so we see sort of a clear path between the paper and re-review and eventual acceptance. I spent some time editing the manuscript, and my goal isn't to copy edit the manuscript. We actually have professional copy editors for that, but to make sure that it's going to read well and that the structure flows in a way that it's understandable to our audience, which is a general audience, and you may have people from other communities reading the paper. And so it can be useful to have somebody else provide some input into this. Sometimes when you're doing your own research and really tied up in your own research field, you forget to tell people exactly why it's important in sort of a very broad and general sense in the introductory paragraphs. I spend time interacting with the journalists and production and art departments at Science itself to put things together. And of course, I try my best to keep up with other journals. I always look at what's going on, what Nature's publishing, Nature Geoscience, Nature Materials, and a handful of other of journals. I try to keep up with. It's hard, but do what you can. All right, so let's get into some numbers. What do we publish in science? So the general breakdown between physical and biological sciences is about 41% physical, 58% biological. You might ask yourself, what is this little sliver? What else might we be publishing? We actually publish a handful of papers in economics and social science, and so that accounts for this little 1%. We do try to cover a broad range of areas, as we are a general scientific publication. And just to break this down a little bit further, so here's the physics little pie wedge. And it's pretty evenly distributed amongst these sort of general topic areas. There's geology, material science, physics, planetary, and we try to keep a pretty broad topical balance. I'll show you the biological sciences in case you work in that area. These are broken down into much finer topic sections, but you can see that these wedges are all relatively uniform. All right, and just another view of this by these little bubbles here. There's there's materials at 7%, physics 10%, earth science is about 7% of our published content. All right, getting to where we publish from. So this is basically the first and corresponding authors, which is really the only type of tabulation we can make easily in our system. You'll see that between 94 and 98, we're like at 75% US-based authors. And between 2010 and 2014, this amount is going down, and it's going to continue to decrease as there's more investment around the world in research that's really high profile. Much of the growth here is actually in the Asian countries and a little bit in the UK and Germany. And this mainly is just to say that we're not a US-based journal. We do encourage international authors. And I'll also say that this little pie wedge probably very much underrepresents the amount of international input, as many papers, even if they have a first or a corresponding author that's US-based, they collaborate with international research groups. And so it's a little bit deceptive, but... All right, so if you're asking yourself how hard is it to get a paper in science, the answer is it's pretty hard. This is the number of submissions we've had from 1995 to 2015 over time. So you have this like ramp up here, and luckily it kind of like evens out and maybe is even decreasing a little bit here. Unfortunately, the number of papers we actually publish in our journal is down here. Okay, so like how do you go from being one of these 12,000 to being one of these 800 that's actually published? It's a pretty big task, but there's things that we're looking for that will help out when you're deciding where to submit your paper. I think the next slide. Oh yeah, this is the somewhat depressing slide. I guess it's mixed news. So we'd like to show when we go on international trips how various countries are doing in terms of what the fraction of publication is. So you can see the U.S. is kind of steadily going down. France has actually stayed about even over the last 20 years at about 3% of our content, first and corresponding authors. And so, I mean, that's at least it's not going down, right? And so you're maintaining the same level. It's not as fun. So when I present this talk in China, there's like goes like this, it's like maybe up to like 2%, and you can be like, well, if you continue this trend, it's going to go up to 100% in a couple years. But yeah, so it's evened out. I don't know if there's too much to read into it. It's statistics of small numbers, put it that way. Okay, so what we're looking for: upside down Eiffel Towers. We're looking for papers. If you think your paper is competitive for science, the editorial staff is looking for a couple things, and these are very broad statements that are a little bit hard to parse, but. We are looking for things that are a big step forward. We really want transformational research. We don't have that many pages in our magazine to print stuff, And so we want to make sure that the 800 papers we print are really high quality and represent a big change in the way people think. We like papers that have broad implications, so something that might be cross-disciplinary or cut across several different topic areas can be something we will be interested in. It's always really important having novel results. It's very good to have novel results. If you have something that no one else has, it'll allow you to do some science that other people can't do. And so really cutting-edge results are something that are definitely of interest to us. These things are a little bit less appreciated in terms of how we think about things in our editorial process. There are topic areas that are more or less timely. So there's some topic areas that are very slow-moving and some that are very quick-moving. And we tend to have a preference for the quick-moving topic areas. So stuff where you're having really active debates and you're having publications kind of come out very quickly. We're also looking for something that's a self-contained result, and that's getting harder to do with the amount of material you need to support your scientific claims. And we also want a story that fits in 4 journal pages. That's been alleviated a little bit by the supplementary materials, which are a blessing and a curse. I think we all worry that the supplements aren't getting reviewed as well as they should be, but it does allow you to sort of condense your actual story down to this 4 journal pages that we can print while still providing the technical details in an online supplement. All right, so that's sort of in broad strokes what we're looking for. And what I'm going to do is try to step you through our publishing model. And I'm going to take a little bit of, there's going to be some diversions as I go through each step where I talk about specific things in terms of how it relates to publishing in general. So as I said, we kind of start with 12,000 submissions. And I think that before you submit to Science or really submit anywhere, you really should think about your content of your paper. The first thing that you should really consider is to make sure you have convincing data and analysis. I mean, that sounds obvious, but sometimes you feel a lot of pressure to get something out, and maybe you haven't collected that last data set or analyzed it in a way that you know you should. And you should ask yourself if it's a good fit for the journal that you're planning on submitting it to. And a real simple thing to do is to just look at some recent issues and see if the fit is good. You don't want to be wasting time by submitting to journals that just don't traditionally publish in that topic area, or if the fit is not all that good. All right, for us specifically, this website will come up again, but this is the website for submission to Science. It's always good to ask if your results are going to interest other scientists in other fields, and there's an easy way to do this. You can send it to colleagues that you're saying at nearby institutions or at your institution, basically to ask them if they find it interesting and if it's readable and understandable. If you're looking to publish in a sort of a general scientific research journal, it's always good to make sure that your paper actually is readable generally. We do like things that overturn conventional wisdom, so these are the transformational results where fields are really changed a lot. We do want you to avoid excessive and unfounded speculation. I know that we get accused a lot of preferring papers that are excessively speculative, and we try not to we try to cut that down as much as we can. And we do notice it, and it does actually cause problems in the review process. I think it sets up reviewers to dislike the paper sometimes when you've overreached on your conclusions. We don't really like to see papers that are repeat examples of a known phenomenon. There's some phenomenon like gravitational waves where having a couple observations is really great, and they're all important in of themselves. But many times, there's like a sort of a transformational discovery, and you don't really need a second confirmation in a high-profile journal. And this is probably the biggest one, is small advances over previously published work. Of course, what you consider a small advance and what we consider a small advance might be completely different. But we're really looking for the sort of big leaps forward rather than the incremental results. And the incremental results are often better suited for a more specialized journal. All right, another thing before you submit that's really probably more important than at least I realized when I was doing my own academic research is the cover letter. The cover letter for someone like me who handles papers across a wide range of fields is really important. So the cover letter should actually outline the conclusion and why they're important in plain language without exaggeration. You should discuss why the work is exciting or novel, and you should have referee suggestions and exclusions. Of course, nowadays on websites you can input these as well, but it doesn't hurt to basically tell me why you think various referees are good or not good in the cover letter. And the cover letter is useful, especially when I read a paper where I don't quite understand what the point is or why it's important. And sometimes the importance of a paper is self-evident to people in the field, but maybe not to somebody that's slightly outside the field. And this gets back into like if the introduction is broad and general or not, which is sometimes easy to leave off. And so this is an opportunity basically to say, why it's important, and it might be what everyone in the field already knows, but repeating it can be quite helpful when we're considering if we're going to send it out for peer review. All right, so basically, after you do submit one of these 12,000 submissions, the paper goes through an initial evaluation period. And the initial evaluation, as you can see, will kick out something like 75% of the manuscripts that we consider. I don't think the community that we interact with, the communities we interact with, have the bandwidth to review every single paper that we get submitted to us. And because we're space limited, we really try to cut down on the ones that we don't think are going to be competitive in peer review, sort of off the top. So our initial evaluation period is only within 1 to 2 weeks. Our goal is not to waste a bunch of your time. It's to try to give you the feedback as quickly as possible if we're not going to send it to in-depth review. And the way that the initial evaluation works is that first what we do is we send it to one or more of our members of the board of reviewing editors. These are over 100 practicing scientists across a very wide range of fields. And their goal, they're basically there to provide feedback. If the topic is of interest, maybe give us a little bit of history of the topic, and also to suggest referees or reviewers for the paper. And they're very helpful and helps us be able to handle such a wide range of topic areas because they give us insights that we may not know. And they also offer long-term strategic advice about what we publish, and also sometimes they ask us if we're interested in commentary pieces for the front part of the magazine. But between the advice of the board of reviewing editors, we basically will circulate a paper amongst at least one other editor and make a decision whether we're going to send it out for peer review or not. So more than one person is going to be looking at your manuscript when you send it to us for that initial evaluation. And basically, if we reject a paper, it's because the paper we feel is not appropriate for science. And that can be for a variety of reasons. It does not mean that it's bad research. We get incredibly good research that we turn away. Probably the thing that surprised me the most when I started 3 years ago is how high the quality is, like just starting out. The quality of papers that we get is quite good. We're really spoiled in that respect. All right, so if you're part of this lucky 25% that moves forward, we move into the peer review process here. So the goal of peer review is to assess both the quality of the manuscript and also to help determine if it's appropriate for science. As I said, some of this happens in the initial evaluation stage, but we also ask reviewers to comment on that a little bit as well, because sometimes things that we think are important, reviewers don't think are important for science. And the goal when I'm running things through peer review is to do this cycle 2 times if we're going to accept the paper, and to do it 1 time if we're not. I think once you start getting into multiple rounds of peer review, you start running into problems with reviewer fatigue. You start delaying a paper getting out in any journal. And in general, I don't think it serves the community well to try to go through this process over and over and over again. Right, so why do we even do peer review? So I think that I like this cartoon a lot because at least when I was writing papers, it kind of felt like this was happening. This would be 6 reviewers, so good luck getting your paper through that gauntlet. There's a reason that we have this sort of process set up in science, science in general. And peer review is basically a shared societal responsibility amongst researchers, reviewers, and publishers. And it's really a fundamental aspect of the integrity and accountability of science as well as its advancement. I think it's been a really important development in the last, 50 or 60 years that we have such strong and responsible peer review system. And so that's something that we consider to be really important for what we ultimately decide to publish. So you may ask, how do I decide who's going to look at these papers? Well, it's a combination of different things. As I mentioned, the board of reviewing editors often provide really good suggestions. I actually do look at author suggestions. In addition, we have a database, so I can look at the prior reviews of researchers that have reviewed papers in the topic area. I'll look at websites and author profiles sometimes, and also literature searches. So that includes looking at things that have been if you've heavily cited something in your manuscript, I'm probably going to turn to that group to assess your manuscript. So just to dig a little bit deeper on the author suggestions, if you're trying to think of people to suggest, you should suggest well-respected researchers in your field, people that are knowledgeable and fair. I actually always like to see some younger researchers. There's obviously some very well-respected scientists that tend to get suggested over and over again, and they're great and provide good reviews. But I'm also looking at trying to develop the next generation of peer reviewers, and it's good to be able to give young researchers a chance to review a paper. As I mentioned, groups you cite a lot in the reference list. When I say internationally based, I mean non-US based reviewers. It's good for us because sometimes in the US we don't have a good appreciation for who's doing what where, and so by suggesting reviewers that may be based elsewhere, they'll put them on our radar, and maybe they're people that we want to get papers from in the future. And something also that people don't really think about too much is to basically suggest people from industry, especially if your paper has a sort of an applied aspect to it. It can be really good to have somebody from industry comment on the paper. Sometimes they give very good and insightful advice. So what to avoid? There's a couple things that I strongly recommend avoiding when you're recommending reviewers. Institutional conflicts of interest. It doesn't matter if it's somebody that you've never met in your institution. We just, as a general rule, will not send a paper to somebody at the same institution as one of the authors of the paper. Okay, so your advisor, you'd think that we'd never let you send it to your advisor, but if you haven't worked with them in about 5 years, then we're okay with that. We'll let them give some opinions. I'm not sure if you want to send it to your advisor, but it's an option after 5 years. Try not to recommend close friends or family members. Close friends is harder for me to figure out. Family members, which actually has happened, is a worse one. I usually know who the family members are, so don't do that. And it's important to try to avoid excluding too many people. And there's a lot of reasons for that. For instance, excluding everyone in the U.S. or everyone in Europe, which I've seen before, is not a very useful thing for us. And it's also just becomes harder and harder to find the qualified people to actually review your manuscript. And somebody that's unqualified is probably more likely than not to write a bad review for the paper because they're not going to understand what went into it. Which gets me to this statement, which a lot of people disagree with, but often other research groups that you might think are biased are actually a lot less biased than you think. Your direct competitors sometimes can actually save your paper. So if you get one good review, one bad review, if that good review is from somebody that we know is in competition with you, it gives your paper a lot of weight and credibility. And people from your field actually will grasp its importance. And so, there's reasons why you'd exclude people in competing research groups. Sometimes you've had a really nasty, bad experience. Sometimes they're actually working on the exact same problem and may have reasons to slow your paper down. And in those cases, we understand completely. But if it's just somebody that you feel like may not like the paper, then you should really think about that and think if that's a reasonable thing to think. All right, so if we do ask you to be a reviewer, everyone should try to do peer review. It's always an insightful process to be part of. You basically, what I like to see as an editor is to have a brief synopsis of the paper, just like a paragraph explaining what it is, and that'll also help triangulate you for the rest of the review. Analyzing the quality of data and the interpretation is important. It's useful for us if you distinguish the paper from related publications or prior work. We like if you discuss the paper's significance and likely impact. And also, it's really important to try to be polite to the authors and to give a realistic time frame for completion. This causes a lot of problems because if you write a negative review and you're really mean about it, then we inevitably get an appeal, and then I frequently have to send it to somebody else anyways. That usually confirms the original review, but it makes everything take a lot longer. Which, I mean, I guess if it's your goal, then I guess it's a good strategy. But it's usually there's no reason not to be polite. And you should also give a realistic time frame for completion. So we ask reviewers basically give us reviews back in 2 weeks. Realistically, it's usually more like 3 weeks, and I can tolerate a month. But it's always good to know that you're going to be giving me the review. And if for some reason you can't do the review, it's really I really appreciate if you tell me that as soon as you can, so I can arrange for somebody else. Part of my goal as an editor for science is to make sure papers are moving through our system quickly and not getting held up, because these are high quality papers that deserve to be published somewhere, and if they're not going to be published with us, it doesn't help anyone to sort of hold them up. All right, so we've gone through the peer review. So basically, once we get these in, we evaluate if they're not positive reviews. So when we do the evaluation, it's always more than one editor that looks it over. And if we decide that the reviews are not positive enough, we will reject the paper. This is something like 50 or 40%, or 50 or 60% of papers are rejected. And I guess the advice I give people that have paper rejected, you're kind of in a bad state of mind when you read the reviews right after you get the rejection notice. And, there are good reasons and very common reasons why papers are rejected. Sometimes there's been too little advance over previous work. Of course, the data and analysis might not be convincing. Sometimes there's observations without interpretation or interpretations without observations. And what I would encourage you to do is before sending me like an appeal or saying that the reviewers are wrong, just think about it for a couple days and see if you can see the reviewer's viewpoint. When I get appeals back immediately, I usually know that they weren't very well thought out. And so there are sometimes reviewers make mistakes, and we have a process for dealing with that. But it's a time-consuming process, and so if it turns out that the reviewers are right, you don't want to waste time on that process. All right, so you also should keep in mind that peer review isn't perfect. You shouldn't take a negative peer review report personally. It's not really reflective of you or even necessarily the quality of your work. You should recognize that journals are space limited. That's certainly the case for science. And especially relative to the number of submissions that we get. As I said, we get 12,000 and we publish 800. Editors like me, I'm really time constrained. And so as much as I'd like to try to run a paper through this review cycle over and over again because it's an interesting idea, and I think maybe with enough cycles it will make it, I just don't have time to do that, to spend excessive amounts of time working with the authors to try to get the paper through peer review. And you also, your work just might actually not fit the perceived audience or the direction of the publication. And that's a little bit less satisfying reason to figure out. But, it's sometimes we send things to peer review and the community just isn't very excited about that direction. All right, so what you should do with peer review comments is you should try to improve the manuscript, and you should do that and then submit it to a new journal. It's a disappointment, and it's always upsetting, but it's part of the scientific process, and that's something you should always keep in mind. The goal is to get your work published in the end. And as I mentioned before, we have easy transfers available to the science sister journals if you want to try another journal in the science family. All right, so if we evaluate your paper, if you get good peer reviews or promising or something, if we think that it'll go through one more review cycle and then we'll publish it, eventually it gets down here to the accepted level, and it's congratulations, you've beaten the odds, and we offer a number of perks when we accept your paper. We have a professional copy editing staff, and so they're quite helpful in making sure all the grammar and spelling is right in your manuscript. We actually have a press team that will be in contact with you. Usually it's only like a week before the manuscript is published, and they'll help you coordinate news coverage. A lot of times institutions like to put out a press release or even hold a news conference when they have a paper in a high-profile journal. And this is always a good idea, just to try to get some more interest in the paper, more generally. We do have a press embargo after your paper has been accepted, and this embargo policy is, I guess, a little bit confusing. I think it's clearly written, but it's hard to understand completely. Our embargo is on talking to news people, like the science news reporters. You can present your work at a conference, unless you think there's going to be a lot of reporters in the audience that are going to report on it. The reason that we have the press embargo is to try to coordinate coverage, and secondly, to make sure that when that coverage comes out, it's going to be reflective of the work that's actually in the paper. Sometimes people jump to conclusions, and part of the goal of the press team is to sort of write up a short summary for the news people as to what the primary important things in the paper are, and sometimes they add some qualifiers. So, and I can actually give you an example. So we have this series of induced seismicity papers, and in the Oklahoma region in the U.S., they're caused by wastewater disposal. When we published a paper about earthquakes in Canada, those are actually related to the fracking process itself, so the injection for the unconventional oil exploration. And when the New York Times published a little blurb about it, I was really happy because I made the press team make it very clear that the fracking-induced earthquakes only were happening in Canada. And so it said something like fracking-induced earthquakes, in Canada. And so that's really important because, if you let information out early, you might get something that's just not representative of what's actually going on. There's a big difference between fracking causes earthquakes and fracking causes earthquakes sometime in Canada. So, all right, so we have a number of access policies. So once you have a paper that's accepted, our goal, and as an editor, I think that my preference would be that we just make it free immediately to everyone. But that's not how the business side of things works. And we do rely on subscriptions in order to pay, like my salary, for instance. But we do do a number of things that I think make our papers quite available, at least as available as we can. So something that a lot of people don't realize is that basically after 12 months, all of our research papers are free. And I think that we may have gotten rid of the registration part of this as well. I can't remember if they've done that yet or not. I know we were talking about it. This is what we call green open access, which is to distinguish it from gold open access, where you basically, your paper is available to anyone, and anyone can do anything with it, which is the second part is maybe not quite as well appreciated. And, so supplemental materials are free. This is for the sort of health sciences people. They have some other conditions about 6 months after publication, the NIH and the Wellcome Trust. Papers that have immediate relevance. So if anyone in this room is working on like some sort of contagious outbreak, then we'll publish that immediately. We actually also let you post the accepted paper on your own website. We provide a link for that. You retain copyright, and we also allow posting on preprint servers. And so between all of these different ways, we hope that you're able to get your paper out to at least the people that are directly in your community and probably to a wider audience. All right, so we do have some conditions for being an author of science. We have this license to publish and conflict of interest form right here. That's pretty straightforward, and there's a number of institutions where we've worked out different agreements in terms of copyright and all this other stuff. And if you're part of one of those institutions, we've probably worked with you before. We're moving towards, actually I think now we're demanding that people provide ORCID for unique identification. And this is for a very pragmatic reason, which is that not only do we have multiple people with the same name in our database, we also have multiple email addresses for the same person in the database. And so the goal is eventually to harmonize that with a single identification number, so we know that we can basically keep all of your submissions and all of your reviews in one spot and not have it spread out over several accounts. All right. We also have some data policies that we've been that have sort of evolved over time. So all data and references must be available at the time of publication. So we do not allow for personal communications. However, you can cite a preprint. The main goal is to make sure everything is available when we publish a paper. We're trying to encourage people to use public repositories. How you feel about that and how comfortable you are with that, I think, is a bit field specific. Some fields have really moved towards this, and some fields don't really have a repository to send their stuff to. There's some more general ones like Dryad that you can do. I mean, we also can host your data as long as it's not too large, and so that's another option. We actually also ask for a specific statement in the acknowledgments about data availability. So we ask you to tell us where the data is and how you can get it. We do ask that all reasonable requests for data or material must be fulfilled. And then we have one very specific for fossils and rare specimens. And this one's actually a little bit more stringent than, say, the materials requirement. And it comes from the fact that there's been some issues in paleontology with fossils from private collections, not no one being able to access it or like verify or check the research. And so at this point, we ask that these things be deposited in a public museum or a repository so they're actually available for research. So it's sort of a special case. All right, so part of the reason that we do all these things, the authorship forms and the data policies, is to basically to try to avoid any issues with misconduct or fraud. We basically notify all co-authors upon manuscript submission to check authorship. So don't try to sneak some famous guy on to your paper. If that person is paying attention, they'll know they're on a paper that maybe they didn't ever see. We actually, as I said, we have detailed authorship and conflict of interest disclosures before acceptance by all authors. We actually do check figures now for inappropriate adjustments. There's been a number of problems in mostly the biological sciences with images being manipulated. And so we do check to make sure that the images aren't manipulated. As I mentioned before, we don't allow for unpublished data. We also, a couple years ago, we asked some statisticians to help us out. And so we have a statistics board of reviewing editors. And their goal is basically to look at the integrity of the statistical analysis itself. And so they come into play if you have a paper that is reasonably statistics heavy after we decide to send it out for a review, but before we get the review reports back. And the statistics board or reviewing editor will basically look at the statistical methods, tell us if they're robust, and basically give us guidance if people need to add more information so that the statistics are as bulletproof as possible. So I think that's been a really good thing that we've done. And as I mentioned, data availability. So if you make your data available, it's a little bit harder to get away with misconduct or outright fraud. Right. So yeah, if scientific fraud is bad, I think that's pretty obvious, and you know we've had examples of it along with other institutions, and unfortunately they tend to get an outsized amount of attention when these things happen, and I think it really ends up eroding public confidence in science, and so you know we worry about it. We worry about it as a high-profile publication and try to do our best to prevent it. And, you know, I think it's worth just stating that it's not okay to fabricate or plagiarize data. So if you're thinking about doing that, I would just not do it. Usually it's, in some way, and sometimes it's kind of amazing the lengths people go to plagiarize data. It's almost more work than actually doing the experiments. So, all right. So, you know, with all this information, you know, maybe you're ready to send us a paper. You know, we have this website here. In addition to a whole bunch of information, which I'll get to in a second. But it's always instructive to look at how things have changed since 1880. So this is the original instructions to authors. There was only a couple paragraphs here. And there is really stringent requirements, like writing legibly on one side of the paper only. And yeah, send it by post. These days, instructions for author are much more extensive, so we have all these different categories. If you do have questions, I think most of them are answered on this website. Yeah, we have different categories of manuscripts these days. We have instructions for preparing an initial manuscript, and then we also have this little guide for figures, which is actually quite useful, but much more involved than it was in 1880. And so I think with that, I'll thank you for spending some time listening to me, and I'm very happy to take any questions that you might have.
Are there any questions? Comments? Manuscripts ready?
So thanks, Brent, for the seminar. I have just a general question that is also a personal question to you. So science, have a kind of responsibility to open new fields and explore new direction of science. So did you have sometimes the feeling that you are, making a mistake or overestimating specific work as a kind of the idea to born Giordano Bruno once more or not?
So do I ever think that I've made a mistake? Yes. Yeah, it's a tough balance because, we want cutting edge research and we also want stuff that may open up new fields. And sometimes fields aren't quite ready to be opened, and sometimes the cutting edge results are wrong. And we do our best with what we have with the review process. And unless somebody, our sort of standard, philosophy is when something ends up being, incorrect, we only really want to retract it if it's been shown to be fraudulent, because things can be incorrect for good reasons and things can be incorrect for fraudulent reasons. But, getting back to trying to open up new fields, it's really challenging, right? Because, like a lot of times you'll look at a topic area and there's really there's no papers to compare it to. There's no idea how big the communities are necessarily. And sometimes we just take risks, and sometimes they pay off, and sometimes there's a pulse of interest, and then it just kind of wanes away. So, yeah. What's helpful though is that we have editors that have been there for quite a long time, and so they provide some good guidance as to what they see as something that might be a good field to move into. Yeah.
Thank you.
Another question? Okay, one I have in the meantime, you think about it.
Okay.
Why should one publish in Science rather than Nature and vice versa?
Yeah, I'll answer that when we get a break.
I was wondering about why do you focus more on the research of which is fastly developing rather than on the research which is like more long, on a long side, more important maybe or something.
Yeah. So I think that the sort of standard idea when we're thinking about our editorial guidelines, and this might sound disingenuous, but I think it's really true, is that some of those longer term results or more results that are important for long time period, they often are pretty field specific, and that means that they actually might be more appropriately placed in a field specific journal, like the Journal of Petrology or something like that, where they're going to be referred to back over and over again. I think that I think that things have shifted a lot in terms of the importance of science and nature versus the other subject-specific journals over the last 20, 25 years. So people feel like they're not getting quite as good of a deal when they publish in those more subject-specific journals. And so, it's always unfortunate that's happened. But we've always tried to maintain publishing sort of the sort of cutting edge and quick moving fields for that reason. So part of it is it's just because we have limited space, and it's because what our the editors in chief have decided over the years. And part of it is actually to try to make sure that good publications are still getting good long-term research, and they're not just all going to Science and Nature, if that makes sense.
Anybody else? Okay, Pascal.
So, thank you. So you said that a large number of papers are rejected, something like 90%. How many papers go to the other science journals, and what about the other ones?
Yeah, so that's actually a good question. We don't actually have terribly good statistics on that. I'm not because, for instance, like Science Advances was launched just 2 years ago. I'm not entirely sure if that's a good sample. It's not a high fraction that are staying within our stable of journals. And if I remember correctly, we actually do have we did get a breakdown of where papers that we reject go. There's like a program that you can get that does this. And if I remember correctly, most of them go to like, PNAS, they go to like Nature Communications, these sort of, they tend to actually end up landing in sort of more general scientific journals, by and large, Nature, and then some in Nature Geoscience, Nature Physics, and stuff like that. But yeah, I don't have the number off the top of my head how many actually are transferred and kept within our system in and of itself at the moment, so.
Giovanni?
I have another question. What is, Brent, your expected paper in geoscience? It's in the sense, what is your graal, the paper that you wish to receive to say, oh, this is really the best line, the best innovation in geoscience?
So what is my geoscience bar, basically? Well, it's different for every field. How about that? So, I mean, there's, and things change, to be honest with you. When you have, like a big earthquake, right? Initially it's easier to publish on that big earthquake. And as you move away from that big earthquake, there's been a lot of publications, and it's harder and harder to get something that's, really impressive and needed for the field. So I'm going to dodge the question a little bit and say that it depends on the field. But I in general look for stuff that really grabs my attention, that seems really unique. Yeah. So.
James?
Hey, Brent. Just a question. I realize this is recorded, so if you want to answer off the record, we can do that.
All right.
But anytime we come up with this, great result that we want to send out to high-profile journal, we're always thinking, oh, should I send it to Nature? Should I send it to Science? So what are the reasons why, or what are the differences, if there are any, that I should send it to you or to John Vandekar, or, in other words, apart from the fact that you guys are a non-for-profit and Nature belongs to a commercial organization, apart from that, is there any scientific sort of broad difference, or is it basically...
I think when you're asking that question, I think you're starting to get into some really qualitative things. I mean, like, for instance, we do have a board of reviewing editors, and you can look at who they are, and if there's people on that board of reviewing editors that know that field, I think it's probably maybe a better idea to submit to us first. If the reviewing editors know, and you know that it's a real breakthrough in the field, then it's probably going to go to review. So that's one thing. And then secondly, of course, Nature and us at the moment have a bit of difference in our topical distribution. For instance, Nature has been publishing a lot of papers on the core, right? And we haven't. And so, John, I think, is interested in following that, line. And I think it's very reasonable to send it to them first if there's been a tradition and a history of publishing. I think that if you have a result that you think is competitive in either Science or Nature, I think it's important to try to get it to peer review, right? And you don't want it to get axed before that happens. And I'm not going to comment on which journal is better, because I functionally think there's no difference in terms of the profile, right, that you get. Both Science and Nature papers are highlighted in news stories. They're both really great for your career. I mean, everyone knows this. And so I think that's my sort of qualitative advice in terms of which one you pick. I'd like to say that we might be quicker, but I don't. I always try to get papers either into peer review or not within a week if I can, 2 weeks at most. And I've been really trying to make sure manuscripts are reviewed within 2 months. But that's me personally, and it comes from being a postdoc relatively recently and being frustrated at the slowness of the peer review process. So, yeah.
Can I get a second quick question? Do you plan on getting a tier 2 journal like Nature Geoscience or Nature Materials?
Yeah. So that is something that we're discussing. There's sort of a long history with it. So I think that sort of philosophically, we've only wanted to make new journals in areas where we think they're going to be useful and not overlapping with journals that already exist. I think that the publisher needs to so the publisher is on the business side, and we have a pretty strong wall between the publisher and the editorial side. I wouldn't be surprised if we launch a few new journals, like maybe on the material side, maybe on the environmental side, just because there's, from my understanding, that the scientific community has asked for them, right? And that's really what it comes down to. It's not just about putting them out just to put them out. It's about putting them out where there might be need. And the AAAS, I will say, is very sensitive to not stepping on other nonprofit societies, scientific societies, with overlapping publications. So, that's something that I know that they actually consider, because they don't want to destroy another member-driven organization. So,
I was wondering if you get a feeling how much of the paper you published are actually long-term citation versus just a fashion spike.
Yeah. So. It's very subject specific. The earth science papers tend to be a little bit better with long-term citation rates. I think there's good reasons for that, right? Usually the observations are hard to make and they're hard to reproduce, but they tend to have more staying power than some of the material stuff, which can be more of a flash in the pan. I haven't really been around long enough to get a good sense of which papers, sort of stay for a long time and which ones kind of get a pulse and then dissipate. Most of them get a pulse and dissipate. It's just a matter of what that decay time is, right? So, yeah.
As geologists, we many of base our studies on one or few case studies, so a journal or something like that. And we all often have the impression that to be accepted in such a journal, you have to deal for the whole Earth or something like that. So can you comment a little?
Yeah, so I think that one of the comments that shows up a lot in our database is too regional, right? I mean, and I think that with the geologic stuff, we actually do, we do tend to prefer papers that are global in nature rather than regional, and that's just how it's developed over the years. And I mean, it's kind of our editorial philosophy at the moment. So yeah, I wish I could give you better news. so I mean, sometimes you do measure something regionally that's important for everywhere, right? But you really have to make that case, and that's usually a challenge to make it in a way that's quantitative and robust, put it that way.
Well, perhaps one last question I wanted to ask you. Oh, sorry. Okay, I'll ask my question after.
Do you have to choose if you want to submit the paper to Science or to another family, like robotics?
Yeah, so how it works right now is I think when you submit, you actually can submit it to Science, and then you basically can ask for it to be transferred automatically. It doesn't actually get automatically transferred. What will happen is you say, it's something like if the paper isn't accepted at Science, I'm interested in maybe publishing in Science Advances. And then if I reject the paper, you'll get a link that allows you to transfer the paper. And with that link, you get 10% off of the charges for it. So it's sort of probably a not great incentive to submit stuff to us if you just want to get the 10% off on Science Advances or one of the other journals. So, but yeah, so there is a way to do that. Yeah.
Okay, so my question was about a little bit in the spirit of what Robin was asking. Would you say that science is generally more interested in the investigations of phenomena or of processes? In other words, for instance, nature in its very title is usually stressing the fact that you need to describe something related to a natural process or something like that, at least to some extent. So there's this balance between describing something that has been observed or addressing a fundamental issue or a process. What would be the balance between the two?
That's a really good question. I think that we inherently like the phenomenon ones better because they're like cleaner, right? They're just like, we've observed this thing that nobody's observed before. Isn't that neat, right? I would need to think about it in terms of what my balance has been on the process versus phenomenon, and I'm not entirely sure what it is. I get the feeling that that it's certainly going to be different across fields. Yeah, I don't want to answer that question because I'm not entirely sure, but it's a good way to think about it, and it's not a way I've thought about it before. But that's a good question.
Okay, we still have a little bit of time, and we'll move on with the visit of Brent. We have a schedule, but for those of you who might want to ask more personal questions, we have a little time. Perhaps we can go for a coffee upstairs before we move to the next next place. But I encourage you to let us know if you want to see Brent. Okay, you can send me an email if you're too shy at this point.
Yeah, thanks everyone for spending some time. I really appreciate seeing people.
And thanks to you. That was very enlightening. Thanks.